The Mississippi River is one of the defining features of North America. It begins quietly in the north as a trickle of clear water from a lake in Minnesota, and then it begins its long, unhurried descent southward. Mile after mile, it gathers tributaries and strength from the clear streams of Wisconsin, the muddy waters of the Missouri, and the slow brown currents of the Ohio. By the time it reaches the middle of the continent, the river is a world unto itself, wide, powerful, and eternal. In the 19th century, the Mississippi was more than a river. It was a highway. It connected cities, farms, and distant states in a way no road yet could. Steamboats moved along it constantly, carrying cotton from the plantations of the Deep South, grain from the farmlands of the Midwest, and countless passengers who watched its endless current slide by. To the people of that age, the river was both livelihood and landscape, the great artery that sustained America's interior. When the Civil War began in 1861, this same river became a dividing line. The Mississippi separated east from west, and in doing so, it divided the Confederate states almost in half. To the west of the river lay Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, lands rich in cattle, grain, and supplies the Confederate Army needed. To the east were Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, where most of the Confederate population and industry were concentrated. If the Union could gain control of the Mississippi, the Confederacy would be split, its supply lines cut, and its communication crippled. This simple geographic truth made the river a primary objective of the war. Union strategy from the beginning recognized it. General Winfield Scott's famous Anaconda Plan envisioned a slow but sure constriction of the Confederacy, a blockade by sea, and control of the river by land until the rebellion, cut off from the outside world, would wither. The plan was not glamorous, but it was logical. To choke the South, one had to close its ports and seize its river. The Mississippi in those years wound through a world of forests, swamps, and scattered towns. Its banks were lined with thick vegetation, cypress, cottonwood, and willow. In the summer, the air was heavy and humid, filled with the smell of damp earth. In winter, the water ran higher, sometimes overflowing into the surrounding lowlands and turning the land into a vast floodplain. To control such a river was not merely a military task. It was a struggle against nature itself. At the war's outset, the Confederacy held most of the Mississippi. Fortified positions stood at strong points all along its length. At Columbus, Kentucky, heavy guns looked down from the bluffs. Farther south, at Memphis, Vicksburg, Port Hudson, and New Orleans, Confederate artillery batteries were established to command the channels. Union ships attempting to move down the river would face not just enemy fire, but twisting currents and shifting sandbars. To those who studied the maps, it seemed almost impossible to take the river by force alone. Still, the Union began the effort. In 1862, Federal gunboats and troops advanced down the river from the north, capturing positions one by one. Fort Henry and Fort Donelson fell early that year, opening Tennessee. Soon after, Island No. 10 was taken. By summer, Union forces had reached Memphis, which surrendered after the Confederate river fleet was destroyed in a brief but decisive engagement. Meanwhile, from the south, Admiral David Farragut's fleet forced its way past the forts guarding New Orleans and captured the city in April. By mid-1862, only two major Confederate strongholds remained on the Mississippi: Vicksburg, in the state of Mississippi itself, and Port Hudson, farther down in Louisiana. Between them lay a stretch of river nearly 200 miles long, and as long as those positions held, the Mississippi was still closed. Vicksburg was the stronger of the two. It stood on a high bluff overlooking a bend in the river. The ground rose sharply from the water's edge to a plateau above, where the town and its fortifications lay. From those heights, Confederate guns could dominate the river for miles. The position had natural strength. Steep ravines, thick woods, and winding roads made direct attack difficult. Travelers who passed by in peacetime often remarked on the beauty of the place, the view of the river below, the wide sky, the fertile lands beyond. In wartime, that beauty became a fortress. For the Confederacy, Vicksburg was vital. It guarded the last open link between the eastern and western halves of the South. Supplies from Texas crossed the river at points above Vicksburg and made their way eastward. As long as Vicksburg stood, the Confederacy could still claim that the Mississippi was not entirely lost. Southern newspapers called it the Gibraltar of the West. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president and a native Mississippian, said plainly, "Vicksburg is the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together." For the Union, the goal was equally clear. To take Vicksburg would be to fulfill one of the war's central objectives, to open the Mississippi from its source to the sea. In early 1863, this became the task of Major General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was already known for his quiet resolve, a man of few words, rarely given to speeches or displays of emotion. His victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh had shown both his tenacity and his willingness to endure hardship. By the winter of 1862-63, he commanded the Army of the Tennessee, a force that would soon be tested in the swamps and bayous surrounding Vicksburg. Before the siege itself began, there were months of slow movement and frustration. The Mississippi in that region was not a single, simple channel. It was a labyrinth of waterways, backwaters, and oxbow lakes. Over time, the river had changed course repeatedly, leaving behind cutoffs and sandbars. At Vicksburg, the main channel curved sharply, forming a great loop around the city's base. Across the bend lay low, marshy ground that flooded whenever the river rose. Any army trying to approach from that direction would find itself mired in mud and tangled in cypress roots. During the winter of 1862, the river's waters rose with heavy rain. Grant's men built levees, dug canals, and tried to find alternate routes to the city. They cut through bayous and attempted to divert the river itself, all in the hope of bypassing Vicksburg's guns. Each attempt failed, not for lack of effort, but because the river was stronger than any plan. The current broke levees, the rain flooded camps, and disease spread through the low-lying wetlands. Men worked in waist-deep water, surrounded by mosquitoes, their clothing soaked and their spirits dulled. It was a campaign not of battle, but of endurance. Yet the purpose never wavered. Grant's orders were simple and his belief constant. The river must be taken. The Mississippi, in all its muddy grandeur, had become both an obstacle and an objective, the physical embodiment of the war's purpose. To control it was to restore the Union's lifeline. To lose it was to admit division. Every soldier understood that truth, even if few spoke of it aloud. The sound of the river itself, the slow surge against its banks, the groan of the steamboats, the distant call of night birds became part of their memory. By early 1863, both sides understood what was at stake. The Confederacy fortified Vicksburg heavily. Earthworks, trenches, and artillery batteries encircled the city. General John C. Pemberton, a Pennsylvanian by birth who had chosen to fight for the South, commanded the defenses. His orders were to hold the city at all costs. Inside, the population prepared for siege, storing food and digging shelters. The citizens of Vicksburg, men, women, and children, would soon find themselves part of the battle as surely as the soldiers on the lines. To the north and west, Grant's army spread out along the riverbanks, seeking a way forward. Across the water, Admiral David D. Porter's flotilla of ironclad gunboats waited, their dark hulls anchored in the brown current. Between them lay the river itself, broad, silent, and treacherous. In spring, the floodwaters would rise again. When they did, Grant intended to move. The Mississippi, at this moment in history, became a mirror of the nation, divided, restless, and immense. Its currents carried the echoes of both armies, the smoke of steamboats, and the quiet prayers of those who lived along its shores. The struggle for its control would be long and exacting, fought not only with cannon and rifle, but with shovels, ropes, and the sheer endurance of men against the elements. And when it was over, the river would flow as it always had, indifferent to victory or defeat, yet forever changed by what had happened along its banks. When the war began in 1861, few could have imagined how long and winding the road to the Mississippi would be. The conflict that started with speeches and parades soon settled into the slow, grinding rhythm of campaign and counter-campaign. The Union armies advanced along railways and rivers, learning that the South's geography was as formidable as its soldiers. The Mississippi, stretching like a great dividing wall, lay at the center of it all. For the Union, the Western theater of the war offered both opportunity and confusion. The region was vast, a world of rolling farmland, deep forests, and broad waterways. Armies marched across states that, on many maps, were still partly blank. The Mississippi River was the spine that connected them. Every bend and tributary had to be understood. Every town along its banks could become either a fortress or a stepping stone. In early 1862, the Union began to push down this river corridor from the north. The first steps were taken by a modest fleet of timber-clad gunboats and by soldiers who had learned to fight not only the enemy, but the mud. The campaign was under the joint command of two men, Flag Officer Andrew Foote and Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant. Together, they struck first at Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, and then at Fort Donelson on the nearby Cumberland. These early victories in February 1862 opened the way into the heart of Tennessee and marked the emergence of Grant as a commander of quiet determination. Grant's success at Donelson brought him national attention. His simple telegram to headquarters became famous: "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender." The words were brief and firm, like the man himself. Yet behind that reputation for toughness was a temperament marked by calm persistence. Grant did not seek glory, he sought results. His soldiers, many of them Western farm boys, unused to discipline but responsive to steady leadership, trusted him because he shared their hardships without complaint. After Fort Donelson, Union forces moved southward, deeper into Confederate territory. At Shiloh, in April 1862, Grant's army faced a sudden and brutal Confederate assault near a small Tennessee churchyard. The two-day battle was among the bloodiest the war had yet seen. When it ended, thousands lay dead or wounded. Grant was criticized for being surprised, but his army held the field. Shiloh hardened him. He learned that victory in this war would not come from single glorious battles, but through endurance, holding one's ground until the other side could no longer stand. Through the spring and summer of 1862, the Mississippi slowly opened. Farther west, a fleet of ironclad gunboats, revolutionary vessels built with sloping armor and heavy guns, joined the campaign. Under Admiral Foote's successors, and with the support of General John Pope's troops, these gunboats forced the surrender of Island No. 10, a fortified Confederate position on a bend in the river below New Madrid. It was one more link in the chain loosened. The Union flag now flew over much of the upper river. In June, the fall of Memphis followed. Confederate rams and gunboats fought a brief chaotic engagement with the Union flotilla, but were destroyed or captured. The city surrendered without further resistance. To the citizens who watched the blue-coated soldiers march in, it must have seemed that the mighty river was slipping from Confederate hands. From the northern edge of Mississippi to the mouth of the Arkansas, the Union now controlled the waterway. At the same time, another campaign was unfolding from the opposite end. In the Gulf of Mexico, Admiral David Farragut commanded a powerful fleet sent to capture New Orleans, the South's greatest port. On a foggy night in April 1862, Farragut's ships ran past the Confederate forts that guarded the river's entrance. They endured fire from shore batteries, blazing rafts set adrift, and the hazards of the channel itself. When morning came, the Union fleet lay before the city, its guns trained upon the levees. New Orleans surrendered within days. The lower Mississippi was open to the Union Navy. Between the fleets of Foote and Farragut lay a stretch of river still held by the Confederacy. Two strong points remained: Port Hudson, guarding the river south of Baton Rouge, and Vicksburg, commanding the bluffs farther north. These positions were not simply towns, they were natural fortresses. High ground along the Mississippi was rare, and the Confederates had chosen it well. To pass without capturing them would leave the river under constant threat. To attack them directly would require immense effort. Vicksburg, in particular, stood out as the key. Situated on a sharp bend of the river, it overlooked a long reach of water to the north and south. Any vessel trying to pass would be exposed to fire for miles. The bluffs rose more than 200 feet above the water in some places, and the surrounding terrain was cut by ravines and swamps. The river itself, forever restless, had recently changed course, leaving old channels and oxbows nearby. To navigate these waters was a challenge even in peacetime. In war, it was a gauntlet. By mid-1862, the Union High Command understood that Vicksburg must fall. But understanding and achieving were two very different things. The armies in the West were scattered, their supply lines long, their roads primitive. River levels rose and fell unpredictably, making timing critical. Orders from Washington took days to arrive. Communication between the naval and land forces was constant, but often frustrated by distance and terrain. Still, the pressure to move forward remained. In November 1862, Grant was given full responsibility for the campaign against Vicksburg. He began by advancing south along the Mississippi Central Railroad, hoping to approach the city from the east. His plan was deliberate: a movement through northern Mississippi that would threaten the city's rear. Supplies followed by rail and wagon from depots in Tennessee. But in December, Confederate cavalry under General Earl Van Dorn struck Grant's main supply base at Holly Springs, destroying warehouses and cutting his communications. The raid forced Grant to halt and pull back. The campaign collapsed not through battle, but through disruption. The Mississippi winter closed in, and the army settled into frustration. To the west, another effort was made under General William T. Sherman. Sherman, commanding a force sent downriver by steamboat, attempted to strike Vicksburg directly from the north. His troops landed at a place called Chickasaw Bayou just after Christmas 1862. The approach was through flooded lowlands thick with reeds and cypress. Confederate defenders, well entrenched on the bluffs, repelled every attempt to advance. The attack failed, and the Union troops withdrew. The new year began with disappointment, yet in these setbacks lay the shape of future success. Grant studied the terrain and realized that Vicksburg could not be taken by conventional assault. The natural defenses were too strong. To capture it, he would have to think like the river itself, adapting, changing course, finding a way around obstacles rather than through them. The months that followed would test his patience and his imagination. The Mississippi in winter was a living, changing force. Heavy rains swelled its banks, levees broke, water spread across miles of bottomland. Grant's engineers conceived a series of attempts to bypass Vicksburg's guns by cutting canals through old channels and bayous. If one of these could succeed, Union transports might reach the river below the city without exposure to fire. The idea was bold and in keeping with the restless, inventive spirit of the age. The most ambitious of these efforts was the canal opposite Vicksburg itself. Work began in January 1863, with thousands of soldiers laboring to dig a new channel across the neck of land formed by the river's Great Bend. If successful, the Mississippi might flow through this cut, leaving Vicksburg stranded on a backwater. But nature had other plans. The river rose faster than expected, flooding the canal before it could be completed. Men worked knee-deep in mud under steady rain. Sickness spread through the camps. When the flood subsided, the project was abandoned. Several other expeditions followed: the Lake Providence route, the Yazoo Pass expedition, and the Steele's Bayou attempt, each seeking a navigable passage through the maze of waterways north of the city. Each met the same fate: obstructed channels, fallen trees, hostile fire, and the sheer difficulty of moving large forces through swampland. By March, it was clear that no easy path existed. The frustration was immense, but Grant remained composed. "We must cut loose from our base," he would later write. "We must go forward and live upon the country." It was a radical idea, to turn away from the traditional lines of supply and to move in silence through the wilderness. As these labors continued, life along the Mississippi settled into an uneasy stalemate. Union gunboats patrolled the waters north of Vicksburg, while Confederate batteries watched from the heights. Occasionally, a vessel attempted to run past the guns under cover of darkness. Lanterns were doused, engines muffled. From the bluffs, observers saw only faint shapes moving against the current. When the Confederates opened fire, the flashes lit the river in bursts of orange. Sometimes a ship made it through, sometimes it burned. Each attempt was a test of nerve. Within Vicksburg, citizens and soldiers listened to these nocturnal battles like distant storms. The city still functioned, though uneasily. Markets opened in the mornings, churches held services, and the river continued to roll by. But all knew that greater events were approaching. Rumors drifted up from the south that Union troops were moving along the Louisiana shore, that Grant was preparing something new. Few could imagine what that meant. They would soon find out. In the spring of 1863, the river began to fall after months of flood. The levees dried. Roads re-emerged from beneath the water. The season of movement had come again. For Grant, the long months of failed canals and flooded camps had been a slow education. He had learned that persistence could wear down not only men but obstacles. The road to the river had been long, but it had taught him the patience of the current itself, moving steadily, bending when necessary, and never stopping. Soon, that patience would carry him across to the far shore, where the final campaign for Vicksburg would begin. Long before the war, Vicksburg had been a place of quiet prosperity. Perched on a high ridge overlooking one of the great bends of the Mississippi, it was a city that seemed to command the river rather than simply sit beside it. From its hilltop streets, one could see for miles across the brown expanse of water and the green forests beyond. The river curved below like a giant arm, embracing the bluff before sweeping southward again. In the distance, the flatlands shimmered in the heat, and on still days, the sounds of steamboat whistles floated upward through the humid air. In peacetime, the town's life revolved around that river. Cotton boats and passenger steamers came and went daily, docking at the long wooden wharf. Warehouses near the shore stored cotton bales, stacked in neat, fragrant rows. Teams of mules pulled drays along the levee, hauling goods from river to town. Merchants kept tidy shops along Washington and Crawford streets. There were churches of brick and whitewashed wood, shaded by oaks and magnolias. On summer evenings, citizens walked along the bluff to catch the breeze and watch. The sun set over Louisiana, the sky deepening from gold to violet as the last light caught on the water. The Mississippi was life itself, commerce, travel, and identity all in one. That calm world vanished when the war began. By 1862, Vicksburg had become a fortress. Confederate engineers transformed the bluffs into ramparts. Batteries were dug into the hillsides, each mounting heavy cannon capable of sweeping the river below. Earthworks extended inland, encircling the city in a ring of trenches and redoubts. Timber was cut, roads were reinforced, and telegraph wires linked the defensive lines. The once peaceful riverfront became a line of guns. The warehouses filled not with cotton, but with munitions. The transformation was rapid but thorough. Vicksburg's location made it essential to the Confederate High Command. It stood roughly midway along the lower Mississippi, guarding the narrow strip of land that still connected the eastern and western halves of the Confederacy. Supplies of beef and grain from Texas crossed the river north of the city and moved eastward to feed armies in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Losing Vicksburg would mean losing that vital link. President Jefferson Davis, himself a Mississippian, understood this deeply. He called Vicksburg the nail that holds the two halves of the South together. Its defense became a matter of national survival. To the Union, the same geography made it the ultimate objective. From the river it could be shelled, but not easily approached. From the land it could be encircled, but only through miles of ravines and dense forest. For General Ulysses S. Grant, now in overall command of the campaign, Vicksburg was both a challenge and a prize. He knew that controlling the Mississippi from source to sea would fulfill one of the Union's central strategic goals. Every movement of his army in the coming months would revolve around that single point on the map. The land surrounding Vicksburg was as formidable as any man-made defense. To the north and west stretched the Yazoo Delta, a labyrinth of swamps, sluggish streams, and bayous where cypress trees grew straight from the water and vines hung in thick curtains. In spring, floodwaters from the Mississippi turned much of this region into a shallow inland sea. To the east lay rolling hills and deep, tangled ravines carved by countless small streams. There were few open fields. Roads were little more than wagon ruts that turned to mud with every rain. Even the air seemed heavy, thick with humidity and the drone of insects. Soldiers who came to this country from the prairies of the Midwest called it the Swamp Kingdom. Within the city itself, life continued uneasily. By the winter of 1862, the population had swollen with refugees from nearby plantations and towns. Families from the surrounding countryside came seeking safety behind the city's defenses, bringing whatever they could carry: wagons, livestock, trunks of household goods. Houses became crowded, public buildings were turned into barracks and hospitals, yet there remained an air of stubborn normalcy. Shops still opened, newspapers were printed, and church bells rang on Sundays. The citizens of Vicksburg were proud of their city's reputation as impregnable. Few believed the enemy could ever take it. General John C. Pemberton commanded the Confederate forces there. Tall and reserved, with a full beard and quiet manner, Pemberton was an unusual figure in the Southern Army. Born in Pennsylvania and educated at West Point, he had married a Virginian and cast his lot with the South when the war broke out. His decision had cost him friendships and reputation in the North, Yet among his new comrades, some still viewed him with suspicion. Despite this, he was a capable officer, cautious, deliberate, and fully aware of what the defense of Vicksburg required. His orders from Richmond were clear: hold the city at all costs. By early 1863, Pemberton commanded roughly 30,000 men to guard Vicksburg and its approaches. They built miles of fortifications, stretching from the river northward, then curving around to the east and south. Each strong point bore a name: Fort Hill, Stockade Redan, the Great Redoubt, the Railroad Redoubt, and each bristled with cannon. Dirt and timber parapets formed a continuous line, supported by trenches where infantry could fire through narrow embrasures. Behind these lay the city itself, nestled among the hills, with its streets winding irregularly along the contours of the land. The courthouse dome rose above the rooftops, visible from miles away, a landmark for friend and foe alike. Along the riverfront, Confederate gun crews kept constant watch. They lived in dugouts cut into the bluff, their cannons mounted on heavy wooden carriages pointed down toward the water. At night, the men could hear the river moving far below, a deep, endless sound like the breathing of some giant creature. Sometimes a Union gunboat would appear around a bend, black and silent against the moonlit water. Then the order would be given, and the quiet would break with the thunder of guns echoing off the hillsides. Afterward, the smoke would drift away, and the river would resume its slow murmur. For the citizens above, such moments became part of daily life. Children learned to recognize the different sounds of artillery, the distant boom of river guns, the sharper crack of field pieces, the whine of shells overhead. Women carried on their household routines as best they could, tending gardens, sewing uniforms, and caring for the wounded who began to fill the hospitals. Supplies grew scarcer, prices rose, and rumors circulated constantly. Yet morale remained surprisingly steady. Many took comfort in the thought that their city's natural strength would protect them. "Vicksburg is safe," one local paper declared in early 1863. "The enemy may batter our gates, but he cannot enter." Around the city, nature itself seemed to prepare for siege. Winter rains softened the earth until every road became a river of mud. The forested slopes turned slick and treacherous. Streams overflowed their banks. The air hung heavy with mist in the mornings, and by afternoon the sun broke through, steaming the wet ground. To the soldiers working on the defenses, time passed slowly, days filled with digging, hauling, and waiting. The smell of freshly turned earth mixed with that of pine and gunpowder. Night brought coolness, the hum of insects, and the distant sound of the river lapping against its banks. Across that river, unseen by most in Vicksburg, the Union Army was gathering. General Grant, camped on the western shore in Louisiana, studied the bluffs daily through field glasses. He knew that a frontal assault from the north would be costly and perhaps impossible. The city must be taken from another direction. Through March and April, his men built roads, gathered supplies, and ferried troops along the flooded bayous. They worked quietly, out of sight of the city's defenders. When the time came, he planned to move fast and strike from the landward side, where the defenses were less formidable. Meanwhile, Admiral David D. Porter's gunboat fleet maintained pressure on the river. From their anchorage north of the city, the dark-hulled vessels, ironclads and mortar barges, exchanged fire with the Confederate batteries from time to time. Their guns boomed across the water, echoing between the bluffs like thunder. Smoke rose, drifted, and disappeared. For the men aboard those ships, the campaign was one of endurance as much as combat. The river carried drifting logs, whole trees torn loose by floods, and each could become a danger in the current. The crews lived with constant vigilance. half soldier, half sailor, always listening to the pulse of the water beneath them. Inside Vicksburg, the rhythm of war and daily life continued to intertwine. There were weddings and baptisms, funerals and dances. Newspapers published lists of donations to the Soldiers' Relief Fund and editorials praising the courage of the defenders. Church sermons spoke of duty and divine protection. Each evening, families gathered on their porches, watching the river reflect the changing light. Far below, the water turned from bronze to black, carrying with it fragments of driftwood and, occasionally, the faint glow of a lantern from a passing boat. Few realized that before long, this same river would bring the Union Army to their very doorstep. As spring advanced, signs of the coming storm grew harder to ignore. Scouts reported Union activity along the Louisiana shore. Wagons were seen moving through the distant woods. Steamboats, once common for trade, now carried troops and supplies under the Union flag. The Confederate outposts along the river kept watch, but visibility was poor in the twisting bends and heavy foliage. When the river fog rose in the mornings, it obscured everything: the far shore, the boats, even the bluffs themselves. The world seemed suspended between water and sky, silent except for the faint tolling of church bells from the city above. To those who lived in Vicksburg, it must have felt as though the river itself held its breath. Life went on, yet something in the air had changed, a stillness, an expectation. The fields outside the city grew green again, the orchards blossomed, and the scent of magnolia returned. But behind that calm surface, armies were on the move. The soldiers digging trenches along the bluffs could sense it. The citizens who looked out across the river at sunset could sense it too. The long, uneasy wait was nearly over. Soon the great river that had shaped their lives, carrying cotton and steamboats, trade and laughter, would carry war to their gates. And once it did, the city on the bluff would no longer be a place of commerce and comfort. It would become a symbol of defiance, endurance, and the quiet strength of those who held out against impossible odds. The Siege of Vicksburg was about to begin, and the Mississippi, timeless and indifferent, would bear silent witness to all that followed. The winter of 1862-63 along the Mississippi was a season of water and waiting. The river rose and fell unpredictably, swollen by rain and melted snow from the north. Its color shifted daily, sometimes brown and heavy with mud, sometimes gray beneath low clouds, sometimes almost silver when the weak sun broke through. The air hung thick with mist, and the banks were soft and unstable. To most soldiers, it seemed that the whole landscape had turned to mud. In this watery world, General Ulysses S. Grant began his long struggle to reach Vicksburg. He had already learned through failure that the city could not easily be taken by direct attack from the north. The Confederate fortifications on the bluffs were too strong and the approaches too narrow. Yet his orders were unchanged. Take Vicksburg and open the Mississippi to Union control. For Grant, this was not a task to be questioned, but a problem to be solved, patiently, methodically, and without complaint. In early January 1863, Grant's army camped along the west bank of the river in Louisiana. The lowlands there were a maze of bayous, swamps, and levees. The soldiers built their camps on raised ground when they could find it, but often their tents stood in shallow water. Campfires smoked in the damp air. Horses sank knee-deep in mud. Supply wagons bogged down for days between river and ridge. The men called the region the Great Swamp and joked with grim humor that they might as well trade their muskets for oars. Still, work went on. Grant's mind never stopped turning over possibilities. If he could not approach Vicksburg from the north or the east, perhaps he could bypass it entirely. Find some hidden channel through the A. bayous that would bring his gunboats and transports below the city, where Confederate defenses were weaker. He would then cross his army to the east bank and strike Vicksburg from the rear. It was a daring concept, requiring cooperation between river and land forces and a great deal of luck. The first of these attempts began almost immediately. Opposite Vicksburg lay a narrow neck of land where the river, in one of its long curves, nearly touched itself. It was proposed that a canal be dug across this neck, allowing the current to cut a new channel and carry ships past the city, out of reach of the Confederate guns. It was not a new idea. Earlier engineers had suggested it, and even before the war, steamboat captains had speculated that one day the river might naturally shift course there. Grant decided to make the experiment. In late January, thousands of soldiers were put to work with spades and shovels. They dug under the watch of engineers, carving a channel through the soft, wet earth. The plan seemed simple enough, but the Mississippi rarely cooperated with human intention. The water levels rose unpredictably. Heavy rain turned the excavations into quagmires. As the men dug, the river broke through the temporary levees, flooding the work site and sweeping away tools and timber. Boats anchored near the canal were thrown against trees or carried downstream by the current. Within weeks, the project became unmanageable. The men waded waist-deep in water, their uniforms soaked, their faces streaked with mud. Fever spread through the camps. Malaria, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed many. By March, the canal was abandoned. The river flowed where it wished, not where the generals wished it to go. Grant took the setback quietly. He wrote no angry dispatches, made no excuses, and ordered the work to continue elsewhere. "We must try again," he said simply. His subordinates proposed new routes through the backwaters and bayous north of Vicksburg, where the Yazoo River branched from the Mississippi. Perhaps, they thought, a smaller waterway could provide a safer passage for the gunboats. The next effort was the Lake Providence expedition. Engineers attempted to open a route through a chain of lakes and bayous that wound west of the main river. If successful, it might connect with the Red River and bring Union vessels below Vicksburg by an indirect but navigable path. Work began in February. Soldiers felled trees, cleared snags, and widened narrow channels with axes. But the water levels proved too low and the bayous too tangled. Even small boats struggled to pass. Within a month, this plan too was given up. The river seemed to resist every human design. Undeterred, Grant ordered a third attempt, the Yazoo Pass expedition. This was the most ambitious of all. Engineers dynamited a levee north of Helena, Arkansas, allowing the Mississippi to rush through into an old, abandoned channel that led toward the Yazoo River. The explosion was immense. Water surged through the gap, flooding miles of lowland forest. Steamboats followed the torrent, carrying Union troops and artillery. But the route soon became impassable. Trees, uprooted by the flood, clogged the narrow channels. Confederate forces quickly built forts along the way to block further advance. After weeks of exhausting labor, the expedition turned back, having accomplished little. Still, Grant persisted. In March, he approved yet another venture, the Steele's Bayou expedition, led by Admiral David D. Porter himself. This time, a flotilla of ironclads and transports tried to move through a series of interlocking bayous north of Vicksburg, hoping to emerge on the Yazoo River behind Confederate lines. The journey was almost surreal. The gunboats pushed through water shaded by towering cypress, their iron hulls scraping against submerged logs. The crews hacked at overhanging branches while clouds of mosquitoes swarmed overhead. In places, the bayous were so narrow that the vessels had to cut their way through like pioneers forcing a path in a forest. Confederate cavalry harassed them from the banks. Eventually, the expedition was trapped in a narrow channel, unable to move forward or back. Porter sent word to Grant for help, and only a rapid march of Union infantry saved the flotilla from destruction. Once again, the attempt failed, defeated not by the enemy, but by the wilderness. These months of misadventure became known among the soldiers as Grant's Bayou operations. They were grueling, damp, and seemingly endless. Men labored in knee-deep water, hauling supplies through cypress swamps, alive with snakes and insects. Food spoiled quickly, and sickness spread. To outsiders, the campaign seemed aimless. Newspapers in the North criticized Grant for inactivity. Some in Washington whispered that he should be replaced. Others suggested he drank too much, a rumor that had followed him since his early career. But those who served under him saw something different, a commander who never gave up, who tried every possibility before admitting defeat. Grant himself remained calm. He wrote in his headquarters tent by the light of a lantern, his uniform often splattered with mud, his demeanor quiet and unreadable. "I shall take Vicksburg," he told a visitor, "though it cost me a year and 50,000 men." He meant it not as bravado, but as simple arithmetic. He believed that persistence would prevail where ingenuity had failed. The Mississippi would open, even if the river itself seemed to fight against him. As the spring of 1863 approached, the river began to fall. The floodwaters drained from the swamps, leaving behind black mud and pools that steamed under the returning sun. Frogs croaked in the evenings, and the smell of decay rose from the stagnant water. The soldiers, weary of digging and waiting, longed for movement. Their camps stretched for miles along the Louisiana shore, rows of white tents half hidden among the trees. Steamboats and barges lined the levees, their paddle wheels idle. The men drilled when the ground was dry enough, played cards when it wasn't, and watched the endless brown current flow by. From across the river, they could sometimes hear faint bugle calls from the Confederate lines, reminders that the enemy waited just beyond the water. Grant now faced a choice. He could continue these futile engineering efforts, or he could risk something far bolder, moving his entire army south along the west bank, past Vicksburg, and crossing the river below the city to approach from the east. It was a daring plan, one that would cut him off from his supply base and place his army deep in enemy territory. But it also offered the first real prospect of success. Grant's subordinates were divided. Some called it reckless. Others saw it as the only path left. Grant listened quietly and said little. Then, as always, he decided. He would go forward. Before the movement could begin, the Navy would have to run the gauntlet of Vicksburg's guns. Grant and Admiral Porter spent long evenings on the riverbank discussing how it could be done. The ironclads would steam down the river under cover of darkness, each towing barges loaded with supplies. Fires would be doused, engines muffled. The Confederate batteries would fire as soon as they were detected, but with luck, enough vessels might make it through. It was a gamble, but one worth taking. The preparations began in silence. While these plans took shape, the men continued their weary routines. They built corduroy roads, paths of logs laid across the mud, so that wagons could move. They gathered food and ammunition. They waited for the signal that the long stagnation was ending. In the evenings, the camps glowed faintly with lantern light, reflected in pools of water. Soldiers sat by their fires, talking softly, unaware that they were on the verge of one of the war's most remarkable campaigns. In those quiet days of March and April 1863, Grant's frustrations were many, but his will remained unbroken. He had faced a river that refused to bend, weather that refused to clear, and a city that refused to yield. Yet he never raised his voice. never wrote of despair. He simply moved forward, one plan failing into another, one idea giving way to the next, like the current itself, wearing down stone by persistence alone. In his simplicity lay his strength. The soldiers around him sensed it and trusted it. When spring finally came in earnest, with green leaves unfolding along the bayous and the smell of wildflowers in the damp air, Grant's army was ready. The long months of frustration were ending. Ahead lay movement, the march, the crossing, and the battles that would decide the fate of the river. Behind them lay the swamps and the failures that had taught them patience. For the men of the Army of the Tennessee, the road to Vicksburg had been slow, muddy, and bitter, but it had not been wasted. They had learned, as their general had learned, that even the strongest current must eventually find its way to the sea. By April of 1863, the Mississippi had begun to fall back into its channel. The floodwaters drained from the bottomlands, leaving the levees dry again and the trees coated in a thin crust of river silt. In the still mornings, mist hung low over the water, and the calls of birds echoed across the open spaces. After months of standing still, the river seemed to breathe again, slower, steadier, and full of quiet power. On its western bank, General Ulysses S. Grant's army stirred with the same sense of movement. The long season of waiting was ending. Grant had come to see the river differently from the way most men did. To others, it was an obstacle, wide, dangerous, and unpredictable. To him, it was a road, one that could be mastered if approached with patience and daring. He knew that to capture Vicksburg, he would have to go with the river, not against it. His new plan was both simple and audacious. Move his entire army south along the Louisiana side, beyond the range of the city's guns, cross to the eastern bank below Vicksburg, and attack the city from behind. It would mean abandoning traditional lines of supply and living off the land in enemy territory. It would mean trusting the river and his men completely. The movement began quietly in early April. The army marched southward along the levees, through stretches of forest and field that had only recently emerged from the floods. Wagons creaked along muddy roads, wheels sinking deep into the soft ground. The columns stretched for miles, blue-coated soldiers moving steadily between the river on one side and the low, flooded bayous on the other. The air was heavy with the smell of damp soil and the faint sweetness of spring blossoms. Insects swarmed in clouds. At night, campfires flickered along the riverbank like a long chain of stars reflected in water. Across the river, Vicksburg watched and waited. From the high bluffs, Confederate lookouts could see glimpses of the Union camps on the far shore, smoke rising, steamboats moored, lines of men marching in the distance. But they could not tell what Grant intended. Some believed he was retreating. Others thought he might try once more to dig a canal. No one in the city imagined that he was preparing to move an entire army past their guns in the darkness. To make this possible, the Navy would first have to run the gauntlet. Admiral David D. Porter, commanding the Union gunboat fleet, volunteered for the task. His plan was simple in outline, but dangerous in execution. On a moonless night, his ironclads and transports would steam down the Mississippi, hugging the western shore, and attempt to pass beneath Vicksburg's batteries. The city's heavy guns commanded every bend of the river, and the current itself was swift. If discovered, the ships would have to endure hours of shelling while navigating a twisting channel in near-total darkness. Preparations were made in silence. The gunboats were painted dark, their decks covered with sandbags to protect the engines. Fires were banked low, chimneys wrapped in wet cloth to hide the sparks. Barges loaded with supplies were lashed to the sides of the ironclads. On shore, Grant's men waited in the shadows, listening to the steady hiss of the river and the low murmur of voices aboard the vessels. Each man knew what was at stake. If the fleet could pass, the campaign would move forward. If not, months of effort would be lost. On the night of April 16th, the ships moved. At 10 o'clock, the lead gunboat, the Benton, slipped its moorings and entered the current, followed by the Lafayette, Louisville, Carondelet, and others. The river was wide and black, reflecting only the faintest glimmer of starlight. For nearly half an hour they went unseen, engines muffled, smoke trailing low against the water. Then, as the first vessel came opposite the city, a flare shot up from the bluffs. In an instant, Vicksburg awoke. Cannon roared from the heights, and the river erupted in light and sound. The night became chaos. Flaming tar barrels rolled down the slopes to illuminate the channel. Confederate gunners, half blinded by the glare, fired by instinct. The great shells whistled through the darkness and burst over the water in showers of sparks. The Union ships answered with their own guns, flashes lighting the low clouds. For hours the duel continued as the fleet drifted downstream, each ship fighting both the current and the storm of iron. From the western bank, Grant's soldiers watched in silence, their faces lit by the distant flashes. They could hear the whistle of shot, the thunder of guns, and the faint cheers that followed each vessel that passed beyond the line of fire. By dawn, it was over. 6 of Porter's gunboats and 3 transports had made it through, battered but intact. Others had been hit, and one transport was set ablaze, its cargo of supplies crackling in the early light before sinking beneath the surface. But the passage was a success, a triumph of nerve and endurance. Grant now had a fleet south of Vicksburg, and with it the means to cross the river. The days that followed were filled with quiet but purposeful movement. More transports were prepared to repeat the run, and by late April, enough vessels had gathered below the city to ferry an entire army. Grant's troops, still on the Louisiana side, continued their march southward. They reached a point opposite the small hamlet of Bruinsburg, where the riverbank offered a firm landing, and the bluffs on the eastern side were lightly held. There, the army would cross. On the evening of April 30th, the operation began. The river was calm, flowing slow and deep under the stars. The moon rose late, casting a pale sheen across the water. One by one, the transports pushed off from the western bank, their paddle wheels turning steadily. Soldiers crowded the decks, rifles stacked beside them, faces silent in the dim light. Behind them, the gunboats formed a line of protection, their dark silhouettes moving like shadows. No Confederate guns opened fire. The crossing had taken them by surprise. When dawn came, Union troops stood on Mississippi soil once more. They formed ranks along the east bank, stretching inland across gentle hills and meadows, green with spring grass. Birds called from the trees. The air smelled of dew and river mist. For a moment, it seemed as if the war had vanished, replaced by the simple beauty of morning. But by noon, the stillness gave way to the sound of marching columns and distant skirmish fire. Grant had done what no one thought possible, crossed a major river in the face of an enemy, and landed unopposed. From this point, everything changed. Grant's army, now numbering over 40,000 men, began to move inland. With no secure supply line behind him, he ordered the men to live off the country, gathering food and forage as they advanced. It was a bold departure from standard military practice, but the countryside proved rich enough to sustain them. The men marched light, unburdened by wagons or depots, and the pace quickened. To his subordinates, Grant seemed transformed. The months of frustration had fallen away. His movements now were sure and decisive. "The enemy is divided," he wrote. "We must cut him in two and then turn on each part." Back in Vicksburg, confusion reigned. General John C. Pemberton received reports that Union troops had landed south of the city, but their strength and direction were uncertain. His own forces were spread thin, some guarding the approaches to Jackson in the east, others posted along the bluffs. He faced a dilemma. To move his main army out of Vicksburg might expose the city. To stay within its defenses would leave Grant free to march where he pleased. In his hesitation lay Grant's opportunity. The Union advance through southern Mississippi unfolded with quiet precision. Roads were poor, the heat already heavy, and the dust thick, but morale was high. Farmers watched from their fields as the blue columns passed. Some offered food or water, others disappeared into the woods. The army moved through rolling farmland dotted with oak groves and small streams. Every mile carried them closer to Vicksburg's rear, and every day the Confederate situation grew more uncertain. Skirmishes flared along the way, brief exchanges of musket fire in thickets and crossroads, but the general advance continued steadily. Grant's confidence, though outwardly calm, was absolute. He rode at the front of the column on a small brown horse, his uniform plain, his expression unreadable. Officers who approached him for orders often found him speaking quietly, almost casually, as if discussing routine matters. Yet behind the simplicity lay an exacting mind. He knew the risk he had taken by crossing the river. There could be no retreat, no resupply. But he also knew that audacity often confused an opponent. The Confederates expected him to withdraw. Instead, he advanced. Each evening, as the camp settled, the men could hear the river behind them, a faint murmur through the trees. It was no longer a barrier, but a lifeline, proof that they had turned the tide of the campaign. From this point forward, the Union armies would fight on the Mississippi's eastern side, pressing closer each day toward the city on the bluff. The river that had once divided them from their goal now flowed quietly in their favor. By mid-May, the change was unmistakable. The long, stagnant months of winter had given way to a campaign of movement. The great current of the Mississippi, which had seemed to resist every plan, now carried them forward. Grant had turned the river, not by forcing it, but by following its nature, patient, steady, and unyielding. His army, hardened by frustration and failure, was ready for what lay ahead. Ahead of them waited the hills, the roads to Jackson, and the open fields where the fate of Vicksburg would soon be decided. The crossing of the Mississippi had changed everything. For months, the Union Army had struggled against mud, flood, and frustration. Now, in late April 1863, it moved forward through the green hills of southern Mississippi with a sense of purpose long deferred. The men marched light, their uniforms faded by months of river service, their spirits lifted by the feel of solid ground beneath their boots. Behind them, the great river flowed as it always had, wide, steady, and indifferent, but now it was behind them, not between them and their goal. The first test came almost immediately. On May 1st, at a place called Port Gibson, the lead elements of Grant's army encountered Confederate forces under General John Bowen. The terrain was typical of the region, rolling ridges separated by deep wooded ravines, their bottoms thick with vines and brush. Early that morning, the mist hung low over the fields as the two sides met. For hours, the fighting drifted back and forth through the tangled landscape, musket fire echoing from one ridge to another. Birds scattered from the trees at each volley, the air filled with the sharp, dry smell of powder. Grant, riding calmly along the line, spoke little but watched everything. By nightfall, the Confederates withdrew. Port Gibson was secure, and with it, a foothold on the eastern side of the river. The men bivouacked in silence. Campfires dotted the hills, their smoke rising straight in the still evening air. Far off, Frogs croaked in the hollows, and the faint rush of the Mississippi could still be heard in the distance. Many soldiers had marched and fought for nearly 2 days without rest, yet few complained. They sensed they were part of something larger, a movement that once begun would not stop. The victory at Port Gibson opened the road northward. The way to Vicksburg lay ahead. Grant's next objective was Grand Gulf, a fortified point on the river that had threatened the crossing. Before the campaign began, it had seemed an obstacle. Now, with Port Gibson fallen, the Confederate position there was untenable. The garrison withdrew, and the Union Navy steamed in to occupy the works. Grant rowed down to the shore to meet Admiral Porter, whose gunboats had supported the movement. The two men greeted each other with quiet satisfaction. Between them, they now commanded the Mississippi both above and below Vicksburg. The circle was beginning to close, but Grant's mind was already moving ahead. He knew that Pemberton's army still occupied Vicksburg and that reinforcements under General Joseph E. Johnston, one of the Confederacy's most respected commanders, might soon arrive from the east. To take the city, Grant would have to prevent these two forces from joining. His plan was bold. March northeast, strike at Jackson, the Mississippi state capital, to scatter Johnston's troops, then turn west and fall upon Vicksburg before Pemberton could recover. It was a campaign of constant movement, relying on speed, surprise, and faith in his men's endurance. The march to Jackson began under a hot May sun. The roads were narrow and dusty, winding through farmland dotted with whitewashed houses and small churches. Cotton fields stretched in every direction, their plants just beginning to bud. The air shimmered with heat, and the men's canteens emptied quickly. Yet morale remained high. For the first time in months, the army was moving forward without hesitation. "Keep marching," Grant told his officers, "and keep your columns closed up." His instructions were simple, his pace relentless. On May 12th, the Union advance met Confederate resistance near Raymond, a small town 12 miles west of Jackson. Here again, the countryside shaped the battle. Thick woods and deep ravines divided the field, making it difficult for either side to see more than a few hundred yards. The fighting began shortly after noon as skirmishers opened fire along a narrow country road. The crack of rifles rolled through the trees, followed by the dull boom of artillery. Grant was not present. He was coordinating the larger movement. But his corps commanders handled the fight with quiet efficiency. By evening, the Confederates had fallen back toward Jackson, leaving the road open. The victory, though small in scale, was important. It confirmed that the enemy's eastern flank was vulnerable. 2 days later, rain fell, a steady, soaking rain that turned the red earth into thick clay. The men marched on nonetheless, their boots slipping in the mud, the sound of their movement a low, rhythmic squelch. When they reached Jackson on May 14th, they found the city lightly defended. Confederate troops, outnumbered and outflanked, withdrew after brief resistance. Union soldiers entered the town in silence, their uniforms streaked with mud and rain. Grant arrived soon after. He rode to the State House, dismounted, and stood for a moment on the wet steps, looking out over the capital of Mississippi. Smoke rose from the rail yards where stores and ammunition had been set ablaze. In the distance, the thunder of retreating guns faded. By noon, Jackson was firmly in Union hands. Grant ordered the destruction of rail lines, supply depots, and military workshops. Anything that could serve Confederate forces. He did not linger. Even as his men rested and dried their clothes, he prepared to turn west toward Vicksburg. He had struck Johnston and cleared his rear. Now he would deal with Pemberton. "Time is everything," he wrote. "We must not give the enemy a chance to unite." The march from Jackson toward Vicksburg began on May 16th under a humid, cloudless sky. The road led through a region of rolling hills and small farms, broken by patches of woodland and open fields of tall grass. The soldiers moved in long columns, their bayonets glinting dully in the sun. Ahead lay a ridge near a crossroads called Champion Hill, a name that would soon be remembered in the quiet records of both armies. By late morning, Union scouts reported that Pemberton's army was drawn up along the ridge. Grant ordered an immediate attack. The fighting began around midday and quickly spread across the undulating terrain. Cannon smoke drifted over the fields, softening the outlines of trees and fences. The roar of musketry came in long, irregular waves, rising and falling like the wind. Grant, calm as ever, directed his corps from a position near the center. When word came that a gap had opened in the Confederate line, he sent reinforcements forward at once. The effect was decisive. By mid-afternoon, Pemberton's position collapsed. His troops fell back in confusion, retreating westward toward the Big Black River. The Union soldiers pursued, marching until exhaustion forced them to stop. The Battle of Champion Hill was short but conclusive. In the space of a few hours, Grant had destroyed the last organized Confederate army between his forces and Vicksburg. The road to the city was open. The men bivouacked where they stood, too tired to cheer. The fields were littered with broken wagons and abandoned guns. Overhead, clouds gathered again, and a light rain began to fall, hissing softly on the grass. Grant rode among his troops, saying little, but his presence alone seemed to steady them. His campaign, which had begun with months of failure in the swamps, was now a series of swift, flawless victories. The next morning, the pursuit continued. The Confederates attempted to make a stand at the Big Black River, but it was half-hearted. Union troops stormed the makeshift defenses, captured bridges, and sent the defenders fleeing once more. Pemberton's men fell back into Vicksburg itself, closing the gates behind them. For the first time, the city truly stood alone. The Union army followed close behind, encircling the position from east to south. On May 18th, Grant's troops reached the high ground overlooking the city's outer defenses. The siege had begun. For those who had marched with him since the Louisiana swamps, the change was almost unreal. In just 3 weeks, they had fought 5 battles: Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and the Big Black River, and won them all. They had crossed 2 rivers, captured a state capital, and driven an entire Confederate army into its fortifications. Now, as they gazed toward Vicksburg's bluffs, they could see the end of their long journey. "We have them at last," one soldier wrote in his diary. "The city stands before us, proud and still, like a fortress carved from the hill itself." Within Vicksburg, the realization of encirclement came slowly. The citizens who had watched the river so confidently through the winter now heard the distant rumble of cannon from the east. Refugees poured into the town, bringing stories of defeat and retreat. The roads were choked with wagons, broken artillery, and weary soldiers stumbling through the dust. Pemberton gathered his remaining forces, perhaps 30,000 men, and prepared to defend the city. He ordered the outer lines strengthened, trenches deepened, and batteries placed at every commanding point. The defenders worked through the night, spades striking earth in a steady rhythm. Lanterns flickered along the ridges like fireflies. Grant, meanwhile, wasted no time. He believed that a sudden assault might carry the works before the enemy could fully prepare. On May 19th, Union troops advanced against the Confederate lines, but were met with a withering fire. The bluffs that had defeated so many gunboats now repelled infantry with equal ease. The slopes were steep, the ravines tangled, and every approach swept by cannon and rifle fire. The assault failed, and hundreds of men fell in the attempt. 3 days later, a second, larger attack met the same result. The earth shook with the crash of artillery, but the lines held firm. Grant saw at once that Vicksburg would not fall quickly. The city would have to be starved into submission. The transition from battle to siege came naturally, almost quietly. The Union soldiers dug trenches of their own, inching closer each night under cover of darkness. Sharpshooters took position in the gullies, their rifles trained on the Confederate parapets. Batteries were established on the ridges, their guns pointed toward the city. Between the lines lay a no-man's land of broken ground and shattered trees. The siege of Vicksburg had begun in earnest, and with it, the final test of endurance for both armies. As May faded into June, the landscape changed once more. The fields that had been bright with spring growth turned brown under the relentless sun. The air grew heavy, the days long and still. The sound of the river faded into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of pick and shovel. From the Union lines, one could see the distant white buildings of the city shimmering in the heat. From within Vicksburg, one could hear the slow, relentless thud of artillery and the low hum of flies over the trenches. The battles before the siege were over. What remained would not be decided by movement or maneuver, but by patience, the same patience that the river had taught Grant through months of failure. Around the city, his army settled into position, its lines stretching like a crescent through hills and woods. Within those lines the men waited, their rifles stacked, their camps quiet. And below them, far beneath the bluffs, the Mississippi flowed on, calm, wide, and eternal, as if it, too, were holding its breath for what would come next. By the final weeks of May 1863, Vicksburg was surrounded. From the high bluffs above the Mississippi, one could look out in any direction and see the thin lines of blue stretching across the hills, campfires glimmering at night, faint bugle calls echoing at dawn. Grant's army had closed its grip around the city with quiet efficiency. To the north and east, his infantry occupied the ridges that commanded the main roads. To the south, artillery overlooked the river approaches. Beyond these lines lay the gunboats of Admiral Porter's fleet, their dark hulls resting in the current, their heavy guns trained toward the heights. The noose was drawn, and it would not loosen again. Inside Vicksburg, the first days of the siege were marked by confusion. The Confederate troops, exhausted from weeks of retreat and battle, took their positions in a ring of earthen forts, redans, and trenches that encircled the city. They numbered around 30,000, weary, hungry, and under constant strain. Behind them, in the town itself, nearly 5,000 civilians remained, men too old to fight, women and children who had nowhere else to go. The once bustling streets were now silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. Shops were shuttered, windows boarded, and church bells stilled. The river, gleaming below, was both lifeline and trap, its far shore lined with the enemy. The first Union bombardment began on May 22nd. From batteries positioned on the surrounding hills, shells rose into the air in long, slow arcs, their faint trails vanishing into the blue before bursting over the city in clouds of smoke. The explosions echoed off the bluffs, rolling down into the valley and across the river. Inside Vicksburg, the sound became part of the air itself, not constant, but always expected, like distant thunder that never quite ends. Houses shook, glass shattered, and dust drifted from the ceilings. Families took shelter in cellars or dugouts, some barely large enough to sit upright in. Those who could began to dig deeper. Within days, the people of Vicksburg moved underground. The steep hills and soft clay of the bluffs lent themselves to tunneling, and soon the hillsides were honeycombed with caves. Entire families lived in these hollowed spaces, their entrances covered with boards or rugs to keep out the dust. Inside, Candles burned dimly, casting flickering light on earthen walls. Furniture was scarce: a few chairs, a table, maybe a small bed if space allowed. When shells struck above, the ground trembled, sending loose soil raining down. In these dark shelters, children learned to sleep through the thunder of artillery as naturally as through the sound of rain. Life in the caves took on a strange routine. By day, people ventured out cautiously to gather water or food. By night, they sat quietly, listening to the muffled sounds of war above them. Letters were written on scraps of paper by candlelight, prayers whispered in the flicker of flame. Mothers soothed their children with stories of peace and promised that the noise would end soon. Outside, the once green hills were scarred with trenches and pitted by shells. Gardens were ruined, fences splintered, and trees stripped bare. The sweet smell of magnolia and honeysuckle was replaced by the acrid tang of gunpowder. For the soldiers manning the defenses, the siege settled into a grim rhythm. Every morning, they stood to arms before dawn, waiting in the gray half-light for a Union attack that never came. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down, and the trenches filled with flies. Food grew scarce. Rations were reduced to a handful of cornmeal or a strip of dried bacon. Water came from wells or cisterns, often muddy or warm. Uniforms were torn and stained, boots worn through. Yet, despite fatigue and hunger, the defenders remained steady. They fired when the enemy showed himself, repaired damage under cover of darkness, and endured. Across the lines, the Union Army dug closer each day. Engineers marked out zigzag approaches, narrow trenches that crept forward toward the Confederate works. The men worked with picks and shovels, often lying flat to avoid sharpshooters. By night, they carried baskets of earth to build breastworks, each mound bringing them a few feet nearer. The sound of digging never stopped. At intervals, artillery opened fire to mask the noise or to keep the enemy pinned down. The ground itself became part of the battle, a slow contest of endurance measured not in miles, but in yards. The soldiers on both sides developed a strange intimacy born of proximity. In some sectors, the opposing lines lay less than 100 yards apart. Voices carried easily across the ravines. At night, when the guns were silent, men could hear each other talking, coughing, or singing softly. Sometimes they exchanged insults. Sometimes they traded tobacco or newspapers by tossing them between the trenches. It was a peculiar kind of coexistence. Enemies bound by shared exhaustion, each waiting for the other to break. Above them, the summer heat intensified. By June, the air shimmered over the hills, and the earth turned hard and dry. Dust clung to every surface. The river below reflected the blinding sunlight like a sheet of glass. The Union camps, stretched for miles along the high ground, baked in the heat. Flies swarmed around the cook fires, and water barrels grew slimy. Yet the men endured it with the quiet patience that Grant's leadership inspired. They had learned to move slowly, speak little, and trust that persistence would do what force could not. Grant himself maintained his usual calm. He kept no grand headquarters, only a small tent near the center of the line, where he worked long hours in silence. He visited each corps daily, riding through the dust on his bay horse, his uniform plain and unadorned. Officers who met him often remarked on his composure. Even in the noise of battle, he spoke quietly, giving short, clear orders. His confidence steadied those around him. When asked by a correspondent how long the siege might last, he replied simply, "Until they give up." Inside Vicksburg, life narrowed to the essentials. Civilians rationed food carefully, stretching what little remained. Flour disappeared first, then meat, then vegetables. Horses and mules were slaughtered for food. Pigeons, rats, and even dogs were eaten. One diary recorded, "We are all growing thin and pale, but we still live." Churches held services in the caves, their hymns muffled by earth. Newspapers continued to print, though paper ran out and editions were written on wallpaper. Each day's headline brought less news and more endurance. "Still under fire," one issue read, "but in God's hands." The Confederate soldiers suffered equally. Their uniforms hung loose, their faces hollow. The constant bombardment made rest impossible. At night, they slept fitfully, waking at each shell's whistle. Many had not bathed in weeks. Letters from home spoke of hardship and loss. Yet morale did not collapse. They believed, or tried to believe, that relief would come, that General Johnston's army was marching from the east to lift the siege. Each morning they looked toward the horizon, hoping to see dust rising from approaching columns. None came. The Union bombardment intensified through June. From the landward hills, Grant's batteries fired day and night. The gunboats joined from the river, their shells arcing high above the city to fall in slow, ponderous descent. The sound of each flight was distinct, a faint hum growing louder until it ended in a heavy, distant crash. The city shook with each impact. Smoke hung over the rooftops. The courthouse dome, once a proud landmark, stood chipped and blackened. Still the flag atop it flew, tattered but visible through the haze. For those inside the caves, time lost its meaning. Days and nights blurred together in the half-darkness. The sound of bombardment became the measure of existence, loud, distant, loud again. When the guns paused, the silence felt strange, almost alarming. People spoke in whispers, children played quietly with pebbles and bits of wood, and candles burned low to save wax. Outside, the sky was bright and blue, but few saw it. They lived beneath the earth, waiting for something to change. Above ground, the Union lines crept closer still. By late June, the opposing trenches were within speaking distance. Union sappers began tunneling beneath the Confederate forts, packing the passages with powder for demolition. The first explosion, beneath a position called the 3rd Louisiana Redan, came on June 25th. The ground shook violently, throwing men and debris into the air. A crater 50 feet wide opened in the hillside. Union troops rushed forward, only to be met by desperate resistance. The fight subsided, but the message was clear. The siege was tightening. Now even the ground beneath the defenders was no longer safe, and yet, through all this, the river flowed on. Below the bluffs, the Mississippi moved at its usual pace, carrying driftwood and sediment gleaming in the sun. The contrast was striking. Above, a city buried in smoke and silence. Below, the timeless rhythm of water on its way to the sea. Soldiers on both sides would sometimes walk to the edge of the bluffs just to look at it, to remind themselves that something beyond the war still endured. "It moves as it always did," one wrote, "though we may not." By the final days of June, Vicksburg was starving. The rations were gone, the animals eaten, the people gaunt. Hospitals overflowed, and the wounded lay in corridors and churches. Pemberton knew the end was near, but hesitated to surrender. Pride, duty, and hope all held him fast. Grant, for his part, waited patiently. He sent no ultimatum, made no threats. He understood that hunger would do what bombardment could not. The city was encircled, sealed as tightly as a jar. Nothing could enter, nothing could leave. Each evening, as the sun sank beyond the river, both armies paused. The guns fell silent for a few hours, and a kind of uneasy peace settled over the hills. The light faded from gold to gray, and the first stars appeared. In the Union camps, soldiers wrote letters home or sat quietly by their fires. In Vicksburg, families in their caves listened to the night sounds: crickets, the faint murmur of the river, the distant call of a whippoorwill. Above them, the sky was clear, vast, and unreachable. The siege had become more than a military event. It was a test of endurance, of human will against the slow, unrelenting passage of time. Both sides waited in silence, bound together by the same river, the same heat, and the same exhaustion. And somewhere in that stillness between the gunfire and the hunger, the outcome of the war itself was quietly turning. By the first days of July 1863, the city of Vicksburg had fallen into a strange stillness. The thunder of bombardment no longer startled anyone. It came and went like the weather, sometimes heavy, sometimes distant, but never entirely absent. The citizens no longer flinched when the guns opened. The soldiers no longer ducked instinctively at the whistle of shells. Even the children, who once hid their faces in their mothers' skirts, had grown used to the sound. The siege had become not just a battle, but a way of life. The city itself was unrecognizable. The broad streets that once bustled with carriages and laughter were now rutted with wagon tracks and littered with debris. Roofs were shattered, chimneys toppled, and many houses stood open to the sky. The courthouse dome, still flying its flag, was pocked with shell holes. Dust hung in the air, tinted red by the clay of the surrounding hills. Each day began with the same rhythm: the rising sun, the first shells whistling over the river, and the faint ringing of hammers as soldiers and civilians repaired what damage they could. The caves, dug hurriedly in May, had become homes by July. Some were simple holes cut into the earth. Others had walls reinforced with planks and furnished with scraps of household goods carried down from the ruined houses above. Families lived side by side, separated only by thin earthen partitions. Candles burned constantly, their smoke thick and sweet. The air was damp and close, filled with the scent of soil and wax. Outside, the summer heat was suffocating. Inside, the caves were cool, but heavy with silence. People spoke softly, as if not to disturb the earth that surrounded them. Food was almost gone. For weeks the rations had been shrinking: cornmeal, rice, and a little dried meat, then rice alone, then whatever could be found. Horses, mules, dogs, and cats disappeared from the streets. Rats became a common dish. A few soldiers joked grimly that they would soon be eating their boots. Bread was made from ground peas and corn, baked over coals that burned low to save fuel. Water was rationed as carefully as food. Rain was collected in barrels, and every drop mattered. One woman wrote in her diary, "We live as if buried alive, eating what creatures share our prison." Disease followed hunger. The heat and lack of sanitation turned every well into a hazard. Dysentery spread through the ranks. Fevers rose and lingered. The hospitals overflowed with the sick and wounded, many lying on straw or bare floors. Flies covered everything. Doctors worked without rest, cutting bandages from whatever cloth could be found, sheets, shirts, curtains, and cleaning wounds with muddy water. The smell of sickness hung over the city like a cloud, mingling with smoke and dust. Yet even amid suffering, there was endurance. "We have grown quiet," one nurse wrote. "There is nothing left but waiting, and waiting is what we do." The Confederate soldiers along the lines held their posts with quiet determination. There, trenches, once sharp and well kept, had become shallow ditches filled with dust. Their uniforms were faded and torn, their hats bleached pale by the sun. They lived on handfuls of corn and whatever fruit they could steal from nearby gardens. Yet they still joked when the shells passed overhead, and still answered every Union shot with one of their own. When asked by an officer how long they could hold, one replied simply, "Till the end." No one asked what the end meant. At night, the city seemed almost peaceful. The guns often fell silent after dusk, and a strange calm settled over the hills. The moon rose above the river, silvering the broken rooftops and the tattered trees. In the caves, candles flickered against the walls, throwing long, slow shadows. The people whispered to one another, told stories, sang quietly to their children. Outside, soldiers lay in their trenches watching the stars, their minds drifting to distant places, to homes along other rivers, to fields untouched by war, to faces long unseen. For a few hours the siege seemed to pause, and life took on the softness of memory. In the Union camps beyond the hills, life was little easier. The men slept under canvas or open sky, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust. The heat was constant, the flies unbearable. Water was drawn from the same muddy streams that served the horses. Food was plain, hardtack, beans, and coffee, but there was plenty of it, and that abundance made the difference. Some soldiers felt pity for the defenders, others only weariness. They too longed for the siege to end. "We dig, they starve," one wrote in a letter home. "It is not glorious work, but it must be done." Grant moved among his troops quietly, as always. He rarely spoke of victory, never of triumph. Each day he rode the lines, stopping to observe the trenches or speak briefly with officers. His calm seemed unshakable. Those who saw him up close noticed the toll the campaign had taken, the lines in his face, the dark circles beneath his eyes. But his focus never wavered. When a subordinate suggested that the enemy might attempt a breakout, Grant shook his head. "They have no strength left for that," he said. "It will end soon." Within Vicksburg, General Pemberton faced a choice that grew harder each day. He had sworn to hold the city at all costs, but the cost had become unbearable. His men were starving, his citizens suffering. He sent messages to General Joseph E. Johnston, still positioned east of the Union lines, pleading for relief. Johnston replied cautiously, promising to attempt a diversion, but making no move to attack. Pemberton understood that help would not come. Yet to surrender was unthinkable, not only for pride, but for the Confederacy itself. Vicksburg was the last link across the Mississippi, the final thread that held East and West together. To lose it would be to lose the river, and perhaps the war. The days passed in heat and dust. The sound of digging and gunfire blurred into one long, continuous noise. The river dropped lower, its muddy banks widening in the sun. The Union trenches crept closer still, their sharp angles inching toward the Confederate parapets. Sometimes the men were so near that they could hear one another breathing. Between them lay a barren strip of ground littered with broken tools, empty cartridges, and the skeletons of trees. Every movement drew fire. Every sound risked a bullet. And yet the work continued, day after day, under a sun that seemed to burn without end. On June 25th, when the Union mine exploded beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, the defenders felt the earth tremble beneath their feet. The blast hurled men and debris high into the air. For a moment, dust and smoke hid everything. Then, through the haze, the Union infantry surged forward, only to be met by a storm of musket fire. The attack was repelled, but it left behind a great crater that filled with the bodies of the fallen. Afterward, neither side spoke much of it. There was nothing to say. Both knew that time, not force, would decide the outcome. The final weeks of June dragged on in a haze of heat and exhaustion. Every day the Confederate rations grew smaller until even mule meat became scarce. Soldiers too weak to stand were carried to the hospitals. Civilians fainted in the streets. Yet still the city held out. Pemberton moved among his men, offering encouragement, though he knew the truth. "We can hold a few days longer," he wrote in one report, "but no more." He was waiting for a sign, some change in fortune, some word from Johnston, but none came. Only the endless sun, the endless hunger, and the slow, relentless bombardment. Outside the lines, the Union Army waited in its quiet confidence. The men spoke little of victory. They had learned to trust their general's silence. They knew that when Vicksburg fell, the river would be theirs, a victory greater than any single battle. The thought steadied them. They built shaded shelters, tended to their wounded, and wrote letters home. Some swam in the creeks when the heat grew unbearable. At night, they listened to the sounds drifting from the city, the faint barking of dogs, the rumble of distant guns, the occasional strain of a hymn sung in the dark. It felt less like war now than a long, shared exhaustion. By the end of June, even the Confederates began to speak of surrender in whispers. It was said that officers could no longer promise rations to their men, that flour was gone entirely, that the hospitals were filled with the dying. On June 28th, Pemberton called a council of war. The decision was postponed, but all knew the truth. The siege had lasted 47 days. The defenders had endured longer than anyone thought possible. The question now was not whether the city would fall, but when. And still the Mississippi flowed below, broad, slow, and unconcerned. At dawn, its surface glimmered with gold, and at dusk it turned to bronze. Birds wheeled above it, and the humid air smelled faintly of moss and water. Soldiers on both sides found themselves staring at it in quiet moments, as if it might answer something the war itself could not. It had carried them to this place, sustained them, trapped them, and soon it would carry the news of what had been decided here to every corner of the divided nation. In the last days of June, a strange quiet began to spread. The bombardment slackened, and the nights grew still. Inside the city, people moved slowly, conserving strength. Outside, the Union soldiers sat in their trenches, waiting for the white flag they knew must come. When it did, the war on the river would end, and the Mississippi would be open from its source to the sea. But until that moment arrived, they kept their posts, listening to the faint hum of the river in the darkness, the same sound that had marked the beginning of this long campaign and that would mark its end. The morning of July 3rd, 1863, dawned clear and still over Vicksburg. The long siege had stripped the hills of color. Grass was burned away, trees splintered by shell fire, and the once green slopes around the city now lay dry and gray beneath the sun. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled faintly of gunpowder and smoke. Inside the Confederate lines, silence hung heavier than usual. The guns that had thundered daily for 6 weeks were quiet. Even the birds, it seemed, had left. General John C. Pemberton stood near his headquarters beneath a tree, studying the horizon. He had not slept properly in days. The faces of his men told him what his reports already confirmed. The city could no longer hold. Rations were gone. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The hospitals overflowed. Civilians were starving in the caves. And now, messages intercepted from General Joseph E. Johnston to the east made it clear that no relief would come. Vicksburg was alone. At around 10 o'clock that morning, a lone Confederate officer climbed onto the parapet of his trench, carrying a white flag. Across the ravine, the nearest Union pickets saw the movement and lowered their rifles. A murmur passed along the line. Then, from the trenches above the river road, the flag itself appeared, a square of plain cloth fastened to a staff, fluttering gently in the still air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the sound of cheering rose from the Union lines. The siege was over. Grant, informed of the flag, received the news without visible emotion. He had expected it. For several days he had noticed the enemy's fire slackening and their trenches falling silent. He ordered the guns to cease firing and sent word to meet. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he rode forward toward the Confederate lines, accompanied by a small escort. The road was dry and dusty, lined with shattered trees and the wreckage of cannon. The heat shimmered above the ground. Pemberton rode out to meet him. The two men had once been friends, long before the war, fellow officers in the old United States Army. They met beneath a large oak tree midway between the lines. There were no photographers, no crowd, only the murmur of insects and the faint creak of saddles as the generals halted their horses. Both men dismounted, saluted formally, and spoke quietly. Pemberton asked for terms. Grant, characteristically brief, replied that he would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. The words were firm but not unkind. Pemberton hesitated, then asked for 24 hours to consider. Grant agreed, and the two men rode back to their camps in silence. That night, as darkness fell over the bluffs, the city waited. In the caves, families whispered that the end had come. In the trenches, soldiers cleaned their rifles out of habit but fired no shots. The air was still and heavy, the only sound the low murmur of the river below. Across the lines, the Union soldiers sat by their fires, too tired even to cheer. They had fought and dug for 47 days. Victory, when it came, felt less like triumph than relief. The men spoke in low voices of home and of rest. Grant spent the night reviewing his plans. He decided that lenient terms would serve better than harsh ones. The Confederate soldiers would be paroled, allowed to go home after signing an oath not to bear arms again until exchanged. It was a practical decision. To imprison 30,000 men would have strained his resources, and to let them return home would ease the bitterness of defeat. Grant's confidence, quiet and absolute, allowed him generosity. At dawn on July 4th, a Union officer rode into Vicksburg under a flag of truce, carrying the final terms. Pemberton accepted. The surrender would take effect immediately. The 4th of July, Independence Day, had dawned over a divided nation, and on this morning, beside the Mississippi, it became a day of reunion as well. At 10 o'clock, the Confederate troops stacked their arms and furled their tattered flags. The Union soldiers stood silently as the gray columns filed past, thin and hollow-eyed, their uniforms faded to dust. No one jeered. There was no music, no ceremony, only silence and the soft rustle of the wind through the ruined trees. Inside the city, the scenes were a mixture of sorrow and relief. Civilians emerged cautiously from their caves, blinking in the bright sunlight. Children who had not seen the open sky in weeks covered their eyes with their hands. Women wept quietly, some from grief, others from sheer exhaustion. Union soldiers, entering the city, found streets lined with pale, emaciated faces. They shared food from their packs, hardtack, salt pork, coffee, and gave water to anyone who asked. The people were like ghosts, one wrote, but they smiled when we gave them bread. The war had taken everything from them, yet in that moment, compassion outweighed hatred. Grant entered Vicksburg shortly after noon. He rode slowly through the city, past buildings shattered by shell fire, past the courthouse where the Confederate flag was being lowered. The Union flag rose in its place, not in triumph, but in solemn recognition. For a moment the wind caught the fabric, and the colors rippled against the sky. The soldiers along the streets removed their hats. Some cheered softly, others stood in silence. It was the 4th of July, and the Mississippi River, divided for more than 2 years, was whole again. From the bluffs, the view of the river was breathtaking. The water shone under the summer sun, flowing calm and wide toward the south. Union gunboats lay at anchor below, their dark hulls reflected in the current. Supply barges drifted lazily nearby, their decks stacked with crates and barrels. The smell of tar and smoke hung in the air. For the first time, from the source in Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, the river was under Union control. The Anaconda Plan, conceived 2 years earlier, had finally closed its coils. The news spread quickly. By evening, word of Vicksburg's fall had reached the northern newspapers, traveling upriver on swift steamers. Bells rang in river towns from Cairo to St. Louis to Cincinnati. Church congregations gave thanks. Fireworks lit the night in New York and Chicago. For many, the timing, the 4th of July, felt like divine symbolism. The Union was restored, at least along its central artery. To those who had followed the long campaign, it seemed as though the river itself had been reborn. For the Confederacy, the loss was devastating. With Vicksburg gone, the Mississippi became a Union highway. The western states, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, were cut off from the rest of the South. Supplies could no longer cross the river. The Confederacy had been split in two. Jefferson Davis called the defeat the darkest day of the war. Yet, even in despair, some recognized the endurance of those who had held the city so long. Pemberton's defense, though doomed, had been stubborn and honorable. His men had fought until food and strength were gone. "They starved rather than surrendered," wrote one Southern officer, and in that they were soldiers still. In the days that followed, the Union Army entered the city in orderly fashion. Medical teams tended to the sick and wounded. Burial details worked under the sun, laying to rest soldiers from both sides. Engineers repaired wells and streets. The caves were abandoned, their walls carved with names and dates, small marks of survival. Grant established his headquarters in a modest house near the river, refusing the grander quarters offered to him. His first order was simple: feed the people. For all his reserve, he understood the humanity beneath the history. "The war is not with them," he said quietly. "It is with those who made it." On the evening of July 4th, the guns fell silent across the river. Admiral Porter's fleet anchored below the bluffs fired a slow salute, their guns thundering once more. Not in anger, but in recognition. The echoes rolled along the water, fading into the twilight. The men along the banks watched in silence. The sun dipped low, turning the river to molten gold. For a brief moment, even those who had suffered could feel the peace that comes when noise finally ends. In the Union camps, rations were issued generously, and music drifted across the lines. The soldiers sang "The Star-Spangled Banner" and "The Battle Cry of Freedom," their voices mingling with the sound of crickets and the river's slow murmur. In Vicksburg, candles burned in windows once more. The people ate, drank water freely, and began to emerge from their months of darkness. The siege had ended, but the memory of it, the hunger, the waiting, the silence, would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Grant wrote his official report the next day in his usual spare language. "There was no rejoicing in my camp when the enemy surrendered," he noted. "Men felt a solemn pride and nothing more." For him, the campaign was not a story of glory, but of persistence, a lesson that steady will could outlast any obstacle, even a river. The victory at Vicksburg, together with the Union's success at Gettysburg the day before, marked the turning point of the war. The tide that had once run against the North now began to flow its way. And beneath it all, the Mississippi continued to move, steady, timeless, indifferent. Its waters, once divided by armies and forts, now ran unbroken to the sea. Barges and steamers soon filled the channel again, their whistles echoing from the bluffs. The war would continue elsewhere, but here, at least, the river had been reclaimed. It carried with it the story of all who had lived and fought along its banks, of soldiers and sailors, of citizens who had endured in silence, of a nation learning, painfully, to become whole again. That night, as darkness settled over the river, the stars reflected faintly on the current. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a solitary bugle sounded the call to rest, and for the first time in many months, the Mississippi slept in peace, its waters calm, its shores still, and its long journey unbroken once more. When the guns at Vicksburg fell silent, the Mississippi returned to its natural rhythm. The same river that had witnessed years of conflict now moved on as though nothing had happened, wide, brown, and patient, carrying driftwood and memory alike. Along its banks, the marks of war remained, broken cannon half buried in the sand, sunken boats, fragments of shell and timber, the faint smell of smoke lingering in the humid air. Yet the water paid no attention. It flowed past the ruined bluffs, past the battered fortifications, past the place where two generals had met beneath an oak tree. The river had survived as it always would. For the men who had fought here, the silence after victory was almost disorienting. They had lived for weeks to the sound of cannon and the constant crack of rifle fire. Now, the absence of noise felt unnatural. In the Union camps, soldiers moved slowly, their voices subdued. Some wandered to the edge of the bluffs and looked down at the river below, still unable to believe that it was truly theirs. Steamboats moved cautiously through the channel, their whistles echoing against the hills. The war on the water, so long a dream, so long a struggle, was finished. General Grant walked the lines in those days without ceremony. He had never been a man for speeches. He visited the hospitals, spoke quietly with his officers, and wrote his reports with the same economy that marked all his actions. To him, Vicksburg was not a place of glory, but of endurance, proof that persistence could overcome circumstance. He once remarked to an aide that the campaign had taught him more than any victory before it. "The river taught me patience," he said. "It will not be hurried, and neither can we." For the people of Vicksburg, recovery came slowly. When the Union soldiers entered the city, they found it hollow and fragile. Streets lined with gaunt faces, houses shattered by months of shelling, gardens turned to dust. The caves, once homes, were abandoned. Some collapsed in the rains that followed, leaving scars along the hillsides. The survivors emerged into a world transformed. The war had taken their food, their safety, their peace, but not their dignity. In the weeks after the surrender, Union officers organized relief efforts, distributing bread, coffee, and flour. The people accepted it quietly, without humiliation. The siege had ended not in bitterness, but in exhaustion shared by both sides. In the countryside, the marks of the campaign were everywhere. Fields once green with corn lay trampled and bare. Fences were gone, trees felled for timber or firewood. Abandoned wagons lay in ditches beside rusted tools and broken muskets. Yet even among the ruins, life began to return. Farmers came back to their land, planting where the trenches had been. River traffic resumed. Supply boats, barges, and civilian steamers, their paddle wheels turning steadily through the muddy water. To travelers passing by, the bluffs of Vicksburg looked peaceful again, their scars softened by distance and light. The fall of Vicksburg carried meaning far beyond its immediate victory. It fulfilled one of the Union's earliest strategic goals, control of the Mississippi from source to sea. The great river, once divided by forts and batteries, was now open. Communication and trade between the northern and western states resumed. Armies and supplies could move freely by water. For President Lincoln, the news was almost sacred. "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed. To the sea," he wrote in quiet satisfaction. It was a phrase that captured both the practical and the poetic, the sense that something vast and natural had been set right again. For the Confederacy, the loss was a wound that would never heal. The states west of the Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, were now isolated, their soldiers and resources cut off. The river that had once bound the South together now divided it. No amount of courage could bridge that gap. The men who had defended Vicksburg had fought bravely, but the logic of geography and endurance had prevailed. The river had always been the North's advantage, and now it became its victory. The war itself would continue for nearly 2 more years. Other battles would be fought at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and Atlanta, each with its own story of hardship and endurance. But something in the balance had shifted. The fall of Vicksburg, coming one day after Gettysburg in the east, marked the turning of the tide. From that summer onward, the Confederacy would fight defensively, its hopes slowly narrowing as the Union closed in from every direction. And through it all, the Mississippi flowed on, carrying gunboats and transport ships southward, their decks piled high with supplies for campaigns yet to come. In Vicksburg itself, the memory of the siege endured long after the war ended. Children who had grown up in the caves remembered the sound of shells as clearly as the lullabies their mothers had sung. Soldiers returned years later to walk the old lines, tracing the paths of trenches now overgrown with grass. Some wept at the sight of the river, unchanged and eternal. In time, monuments would rise on those hills, markers of regiments and batteries, of courage and loss. But for those who had lived through it, the truest memorial was the river itself, flowing endlessly past the place where endurance had met its test. For the Union soldiers, the Mississippi became a symbol of completion. They had followed its course from Cairo to New Orleans, through swamps, forests, and cities. It had carried them through defeat and success, frustration and fulfillment. Now, as they boarded transports bound for new campaigns, they watched the bluffs of Vicksburg recede behind them. Some threw their caps in the air, others simply watched in silence. The journey had been long, but the destination was real. They had opened the river, and with it, a nation's heart. In the quiet evenings that followed the surrender, the camps along the river grew peaceful. The men sat on the levees, smoking pipes and watching the sunset. The sky turned from gold to purple, and the water reflected both colors at once. Far across the river, the faint lights of Louisiana twinkled in the distance. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed from the steamboats being repaired, mingling with the low hum of insects. There was a kind of contentment in the air, not joy exactly, but the deep calm that follows long struggle. Grant, in his correspondence, wrote of the river with a kind of quiet reverence. He had come to see it as both enemy and ally, unpredictable, indifferent, but ultimately honest. It had tested his patience and rewarded his persistence. In its way, it reflected the war itself, slow to change, vast in scale, and beyond the control of any single man. To master it had required not brilliance, but endurance. That lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. As summer deepened, nature began to reclaim the battlefield. Grass sprouted on the earthen ramparts. Wildflowers grew where shells had fallen. The broken branches of trees sent out new shoots. The rain washed away the dust and filled the old trenches with clear water that mirrored the sky. The scars of war softened, but they did not disappear. Each ridge, each hollow, each bend of the river carried its own quiet memory of effort, loss, and persistence. In time, the landscape would forget the noise, but not the shape of endurance. To those who traveled the Mississippi in the years that followed, Vicksburg appeared calm once more. The city rebuilt slowly, its people returning to ordinary life. Children played in the streets where soldiers had once marched. Farmers worked the fertile river banks, planting cotton and corn in soil enriched by war's debris. Steamboats docked again at the levees, their whistles echoing through the humid air. The river, indifferent but generous, gave back what it could: commerce, travel, connection. Yet beneath that calm surface lay a memory of what it had seen: hunger, courage, and the slow triumph of persistence. History would call Vicksburg a victory of strategy, but those who were there knew it was something quieter, a victory of patience. For 47 days, an army had dug, waited, and endured. For 47 days, a city had resisted hunger and fear. Neither side had fought for glory. They had simply held on, each believing that endurance itself was a kind of faith. When it ended, the victors felt no joy, and the defeated no shame. Only the river seemed content, freed from its chains, flowing once more to the sea. On warm evenings, when the sun sinks low over the Mississippi, the water still glows the color of old bronze. From the bluffs above Vicksburg, one can see the current moving slowly, endlessly, through the bends and shallows. The air smells of silt and grass. Cicadas hum in the trees. The city below lies quiet, its streets shaded by oaks and magnolias. It is hard, standing there, to imagine the noise and smoke of 1863. Yet somewhere in the hush of the river's flow, one can almost hear it: the distant echo of guns, the murmur of soldiers digging in the heat, the whispered prayers of families in their caves. The river remembers, even when people do not. And so the story ends where it began, with the Mississippi itself. It had divided a nation and then seen that division healed. It had carried armies, swallowed ships, and reflected the fire of war in its restless surface. But when the fighting ended, it returned to what it had always been: a path, a promise, a mirror of endurance. Long after the soldiers had gone and the banners had faded, the river kept flowing, slow, vast, and calm, bearing with it the memory of the summer when the nation learned once more that time and persistence can reclaim even what seems forever lost. The river flows free, and in its quiet current, the story of Vicksburg drifts gently on, unbroken, unending, eternal.